There is a particular silence that falls when the last door closes and the last voice fades, and you are left at last with no one but yourself. Most of us spend a great deal of energy avoiding that silence. We fill it with noise, with company, with the small errands of a busy life. And yet it waits for us patiently at the end of every gathering and in the long hours of every night. We call this condition by two different names, depending on how it finds us. When it arrives unwanted, we call it loneliness and we suffer it. When we choose it, when we step into it willingly, we call it solitude and something else begins to happen. For solitude is not simply the absence of other people. It is the presence of something we rarely meet directly, ourselves. To be alone, truly alone, is to be handed back to your own company, with all that you have been avoiding and all that you have never had the quiet to discover. Across the long history of human thought, a handful of restless minds have refused to flee this silence. They walked into it deliberately. They sat with it. They wrote from inside it. And what they found there was not emptiness, but a strange and difficult kind of richness. Tonight, we will follow a few of them into that silence. We will listen to those who feared solitude, those who made their peace with it, and those who came, at last, to love it. We begin with a man who climbed a tower to be alone, and in that aloneness, discovered the one possession no one could ever take from him. In the autumn of 1571, on his 38th birthday, a French nobleman named did something quietly radical. He retired from public life, from the law courts and the obligations of his station, and shut himself away in a round tower at the edge of his family estate. On the wall of his study, he had an inscription carved, declaring that he had retreated into the bosom of the learned virgins, into calm and freedom, to spend what remained of his life. He was not running from the world out of bitterness. He was making a deliberate experiment in how a person might live, had watched the France of his time tear itself apart in religious wars. He had seen friends die, including the one friendship he treasured above all others. And he had come to a conclusion that would shape everything he wrote, that a man who does not know how to be alone does not truly belong to himself. We lend ourselves out, he observed, to everyone and everything. Our ambitions, our reputations, our endless comparisons with our neighbors, all of these place the center of our lives somewhere outside ourselves. We live, he thought, in the future and the past, in everyone's opinion but our own, anywhere but here in this body in this hour. And so proposed what he called a back room and boutique, a room behind the shop. Every person, he wrote, should keep such a room, entirely their own, entirely free, where they establish their true liberty and their principal retreat and solitude. It need not be a literal tower. It is an inner room, a place within the self that belongs to no one else, that no quarrel or fashion or demand can enter. In that room, we talk to ourselves, and we should be able to do so without growing bored, for the worst loneliness is to be uncomfortable in your own company. This was the heart of his discovery. Solitude was not a punishment to be endured, but a possession to be claimed. The greatest thing in the world, he came to believe, is to know how to belong to oneself.
The greatest thing in the world is to know how to belong to oneself.
It is worth pausing on what drove into that tower, because it was not simply a love of books. Some years earlier he had known the deepest friendship of his life with a man named La. The two understood each other so completely that could only explain the bond by saying helplessly that it was because it was him, because it was me. Wenla died young, was left with a wound that never fully closed. And here we touch something easy to miss. The man who taught the world to cherish solitude did so partly because he had lost the one person who made aloneness unnecessary. He had tasted perfect company, and then it was taken from him, and he had to learn in the years that followed how to be his own companion. His solitude was not the choice of a man who disliked people. It was the hard-won wisdom of a man who had loved deeply, lost, and discovered that he still had to live with himself for all the years that remained. Perhaps that is why his solitude feels so warm. It was built not on contempt for others but on the memory of love, and on the sober recognition that, in the end, each of us must keep our own company through the long stretches when no one else can. There is something gentle in solitude, then, something almost domestic. He is not a hermit raging in the desert. He is a man in a comfortable tower, surrounded by his books, learning the slow art of keeping himself company. For him, to be alone was to come home. But not everyone who walked into the silence found it so warm. The next voice we will hear belonged to a man who agreed entirely that solitude was necessary, and yet experienced it as something far colder, far lonelier, and far more bound up with the simple difficulty of being a thinking person in a world of ordinary distractions. Arthur was, by most accounts, not an easy man to be around, and he would have been the first to admit it. Born at the end of the 18th century to a wealthy merchant family, he spent his life as a philosopher largely ignored by his contemporaries. Watching rivals, he considered charlatans rise to fame while his own great work gathered dust. He was proud, irritable, and convinced that the mass of humanity was driven by blind, hungry willing rather than by reason. And out of that bleak vision, he drew a hard conclusion about solitude. For the capacity to endure solitude was not a pleasant skill, but a measure of a person's inner wealth. A man, he argued, can be himself only so long as he is alone. The moment he is in company, he must accommodate, perform, shrink himself to fit. Society demands that we file down our sharp edges, that we conceal what is most original in us. Only in solitude is a person free. And so he reasoned that a person will love solitude in exact proportion to the value of their own inner life. The empty mind finds its own company unbearable and flees to crowds. The rich mind, the mind full of its own thoughts, finds in solitude a kind of kingdom.
A man can be himself only so long as he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom, for it is only when he is alone that he is really free.
That image of the porcupines deserves a closer look, because meant it as a portrait of all human society. On a freezing day, he wrote, a group of porcupines huddle together for warmth. But the closer they press, the more they wound each other with their quills, until the pain drives them apart again, only for the cold to drive them back. They oscillate forever between two miseries, the cold of distance and the sting of closeness, until they find at last a moderate distance at which they can just barely endure one another. That middling distance, said dryly, is politeness and good manners. It is the compromise we all strike, never fully warm, never fully free of one another's quills. But the person with great inner heat, he added, has less need to approach the others, and can keep further off, and so avoid both the cold and the wounding. The richer your own inner life, the less you need to crowd against your fellow creatures for warmth, and the less their quills can hurt you. Solitude, in this strange and bitter parable, becomes the privilege of those who carry their own fire. They can stand apart in the cold and not freeze, because the warmth they need is already inside them. But was too honest to pretend the bargain came without cost. Solitude, he knew, offers freedom, but it charges a price for it, and the price is loneliness. To choose solitude is to accept the cold in exchange for the freedom, for that was simply the honest arithmetic of a thinking life. You will be misunderstood. You will be alone. And that aloneness is the tax levied on anyone who refuses to be like everyone else. It is a darker music than where the Frenchman found a warm back room, the German found a free but frozen height. And yet there is something bracing in his honesty, something that prepares us for the next voice. A man who took cold mountain and decided, astonishingly, to climb it on purpose, and to call the climb joy. Nietzsche read as a young man and was set on fire by him. But where experienced solitude as a melancholy necessity, Nietzsche came to experience it as something closer to a forge, a place where a human being is broken down and remade into something stronger. Nietzsche knew solitude in his bones. Plagued by illness, estranged from friends, increasingly ignored, he spent his most productive years wandering alone through the mountains of Switzerland and the towns of northern Italy, writing in a near-total isolation that would eventually shade into madness. He did not romanticize it. He called solitude his home, but he also cried out in his letters and his books against its weight. And still, he insisted that it was necessary, that the highest thoughts could only be born far from the marketplace, far from the noise of the many. He drew a sharp line between solitude and mere loneliness. Loneliness, he suggested, is the suffering of being separated from others. Solitude is the achievement of being whole with oneself. One is a wound. The other is a kind of health that most people never reach because they cannot bear the silence long enough to find it. There is a thought that came to Nietzsche in his solitude, walking beside a lake in the mountains, that captures better than any other what his aloneness made possible. He imagined a demon stealing into your loneliest loneliness and asking, "What if you had to live this life again, and again, eternally, every pain and every joy, every small and great thing in the very same sequence forever? Would you curse the demon, or would you call it a god?" The question can only be asked in solitude, because it is a question only you can answer, and only about your own life. No crowd can answer it for you. It is the ultimate test of whether you have become someone, whether you have lived a life you could bear to live forever, or whether you have merely drifted along on the opinions and habits of others. Nietzsche believed that most people could never face this question, because they had never been alone long enough to have a self that was truly theirs to affirm. The marketplace answers every question for us before we can ask it. Only in the silence of the mountain can the demon's question even be heard. And so solitude, for Nietzsche, was not just a refuge or a forge. It was the only place where a human being could finally confront the whole of their existence and decide, alone, whether to say yes to it. For Nietzsche, the person who flees into the crowd to escape themselves has already lost the most important battle. The crowd offers comfort, but it asks for your singularity in return. It rewards you for being like everyone else. And so he came to see solitude not as exile, but as the necessary condition for becoming who you truly are. You must be willing to go away, to disappear from the warm circle of approval, in order to return as something more than an echo of other people's opinions. He spoke of solitude as a return home to oneself, a phrase that turns the whole bleak picture on its head. The mountain is cold, yes. The air is thin, but it is yours, and the view from it is one that no crowd will ever see. This is solitude transfigured, no longer a tax or a wound, but a summit. And from that summit, we descend to a gentler teacher, a poet who took everything these philosophers argued and translated it into advice for a frightened young man who simply wanted to know how to live. In 1903, a 19-year-old military cadet named wrote to the poet Rainer Maria, asking whether his poems were any good, and beneath that question asking something far larger: how does one live a true life? Replies, later gathered as the letters to a young poet, have comforted the solitary ever since, and at the center of his counsel was solitude. Did not tell the young man to escape his loneliness. He told him to go into it more deeply. What is necessary, he wrote, is only this: solitude, vast inner solitude, to walk inside yourself and meet no one for hours. The very thing the young man feared, his own aloneness, reframed as the ground of all real growth. The difficult, he insisted, is what we should hold to. Loving the difficult, learning to be alone, was not a misfortune to be cured but a task to be embraced. His great insight was about love of all things. We imagine that connection cures loneliness, that the right person will fill the silence and complete us. Thought this was precisely backward and dangerous. Two people who cannot bear their own solitude, he warned, will only press their two emptinesses together and call it intimacy. But love, real love, consists in this: that two solitudes protect and border and greet each other. You cannot give another person what you do not possess. Only the one who has learned to be whole alone has a whole self to offer. And so solitude, in its hands, becomes not the enemy of love but its foundation. The work of becoming someone in your own silence is the very thing that makes you capable of truly meeting another. He asked the young poet to be patient toward all that was unsolved in his heart, to try to love the questions themselves, to live the questions now, and perhaps, without noticing it, to live along some distant day into the answer. That patience can only be practiced alone. There is a tenderness in that the philosophers lacked. He does not command us to climb a cold mountain or retreat into a tower. He simply tells the frightened young man, and us, that the solitude we dread is not a sign that something has gone wrong, but the necessary darkness in which something new is being prepared. Be patient, he says. What feels like emptiness may be gestation. And yet, for all his gentleness, leaves a question unanswered, the same question that haunts every page we have read tonight. If solitude is the truth of our condition, if we are, finally, alone, then how do we live in a universe that may offer us no answer back? For that, we turn to one last thinker, who stared directly into that silence and refused to look away. Albert Camus grew up poor in colonial Algeria, in a household so quiet, with a deaf mother and an absent father, that silence was the air he breathed before he could name it. He became one of the great voices of the 20th century by confronting a single, devastating idea: that human beings cry out for meaning, for connection, for some answer from the universe, and the universe returns only silence. He called the gap between our longing and that silence the absurd. In a sense, this is loneliness raised to the scale of the cosmos, not merely alone in a room, but alone in existence, calling out and hearing no reply. And the temptation, faced with that silence is despair. But Camus refused despair as firmly as he refused false comfort. He would not pretend the universe answered when it did not, and he would not collapse into hopelessness either. Instead, he proposed something stranger and more courageous, that we can find a kind of freedom, even happiness, precisely in accepting our solitude without illusion. Camus gave this courage an image that has never left the people who encounter it, the figure of Sisyphus, the man condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down forever. It is a portrait of a life that seems to offer no answer and no reward, the absurd made into a single, endless task. And yet Camus asks us to look closely at one particular moment. Not the straining ascent, but the pause afterward, when Sisyphus walks back down the mountain to begin again. In that descent, that hour of consciousness, the man is alone with his fate, and he is superior to it because he has seen it clearly and has not been crushed. He owns his rock. He does not pretend the gods will relent. He does not hope for rescue. He simply continues with his eyes open, and in that lucid, solitary acceptance, Camus finds something close to freedom. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, he writes, and the line is shocking precisely because it refuses the despair we expected. The solitary struggle, fully accepted, becomes a strange kind of victory. There is no one to applaud it. There is no answer from the heavens. There is only the man, the rock, the mountain, and the quiet decision to go on. Camus came to believe that in the depth of winter, he had found within himself an invincible summer. The phrase has outlived him because it names something we recognize, that the coldest, most solitary place in us, the place where no one else can reach and no answer comes, can also hold a warmth that does not depend on the world's approval or the universe's reply. He learned, he said, that in the midst of hatred he carried a love, in the midst of tears a smile, in the midst of chaos a calm. Not given from outside, found within. This is perhaps the furthest point our journey can reach. Claimed himself in his tower, paid the cold price of freedom. Nietzsche climbed the solitary mountain and called it home, learned to love the questions in his vast inner silence. And Camus, alone in an indifferent universe, discovered that the self, fully accepted in its solitude, contains a summer that no winter can kill.
In the midst of winter, I found there was, within me, an invincible summer.
We began tonight with a silence, the silence that falls when the last door closes and we are left alone with ourselves. We have followed 5 travelers into that silence, and it is worth noticing how far they took us. They did not agree. Found a warm room, found a cold freedom. Nietzsche found a summit, found a gestation. Camus found an invincible summer. And yet beneath their differences runs a single thread. Each of them refused to treat solitude as merely an absence, a lack, a problem to be solved by more company. Each of them suspected that the silence we flee contains something we need, and that we cannot become whole by borrowing ourselves out endlessly to the world. There is a difference, they remind us, between loneliness and solitude, and the difference is not in our circumstances, but in what we do with them. Loneliness is the ache of being cut off. Solitude is the act of coming home. The same empty evening can be either one, depending on whether we spend it fleeing ourselves or finally keeping ourselves company. None of this makes being alone easy. It was not easy for any of them. Grieved, was bitter, Nietzsche broke, trembled, Camus ached. They were not serene masters floating above the human condition. They were people who walked into the silence afraid as we are afraid and stayed long enough to find that it was not empty. So the next time the last door closes and you are handed back to your own company, you might remember them. You might recognize that the silence is not a sentence but an invitation, a room behind the shop that belongs to you alone, where, if you can bear to stay, you may begin the slow and difficult work of belonging to yourself. The world will be waiting when you return, and you will return as someone who has met themselves and is no longer quite so afraid of the quiet.